Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. I am Bob Allison, president of the Colonial Society. For those who don't know, the Colonial Society was founded in 1890, sharing new and more inclusive stories. And for those of you who may be tuning in via the World Wide Web, if you have a question, you can email it to colonialsociety@verizon.net, and operators are standing by. And my only other role this evening, aside from welcoming you, is to introduce the moderators and actually the genius behind this particular meeting, Ken Torino, who has been a member of the Society since 2021. He's a life member, which means he will be with us for many, many years. Ken is the manager of community partnerships and resource development at Historic New England, where he's been since 2000, actually, since it was the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. And he was also, before that, the executive director of the Lynn Museum. At Historic New England, he has developed and he runs their annual program in New England Studies, which is a week-long seminar in material culture, architecture, and other things. He also, since 1996, has been a faculty member at Tufts, teaching exhibit planning. And I understand some of your Tufts students may be with us this evening. Someone is going to get an A in there. And also a class on reinventing historic house museums. And for the American Association for State and Local History, he's created a one-day symposium on that subject, which he's been running since 2015. And from that, he and Max von Dalboy also wrote a book, Reinventing the Historic House Museum, that the AASLH published in 2019. And he's been a consultant to museums in New Jersey, Louisiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Virginia, Connecticut, and probably some other states, which I would list if we had time. So thank you very much. And also with us is Nina Zaneri, who's been a life member of the Society since 1991. So also will be with us for many years to come. And Nina is
I will be sitting back in a corner.
Yes.
Right.
Nina is the executive director of the Paul Revere Memorial Association, where she's been since 1986. Actually, she has been involved at the Paul Revere House longer than Paul Revere. And the Paul Revere House is the 11th most visited house museum in the country, and the 6th busiest Boston museum, seeing 300,000 visitors a year? 400?
Non-COVID, yes.
Yes. And the site of the Revere House, and actually during her tenure, the Revere House is added to its campus, so it now actually has houses from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. The Revere House itself is she told me to tell this every time I mention the Paul Revere House, is the oldest urban dwelling in the United States, and it's thanks to Nina and the Revere Memorial Association. She's also served as president of the New England Museum Association. She's been vice chair of the American Association of Museums. She's been a counselor and a committee chair for the American Association for State and Local History, and curator at the Rhode Island Historical Society, and one of the leaders in the public history community in Massachusetts and beyond. Thank you, Nina and Ken, for organizing this and for bringing it around.
Thank you very much. It was very generous. Ken and I always love to put the program together. We've been pals for a long time, so this was great fun. It is my great honor to introduce my esteemed North End colleague, Nikki Stewart. She has a law degree and an undergraduate degree from Northeastern. Prior to that, prior to taking on the reins at Old North, she was the VP of Development at the United South End Settlement. However, I think in the history community, she's best known as the co-founder and sometimes host of Hub History. And if you haven't looked into Hub History podcast, you must, because it's full of wonderful stories that don't often get told.
Preservation Award winner.
There you go. There you go. Nikki has done some amazing things at Old North that you will hear about tonight.
And we're introducing our speakers in the order that they're going to present. It's my pleasure, well, first of all, to say thank you all for coming. Glad to see such a welcoming crowd. and he's a professor of early American history at Salem State University. Dane is the author of numerous publications. He's a member here at the Colonial Society. I first encountered Dane through his award-winning book, Salem Place Myth and Memory, co-edited with Nancy Schultz. His most recent book is True Yankees, The South Seas and the Discovery of American Identity. Our next speaker will be Tripp Evans. Tripp is professor of history of art at Wheaton College, and he's trained in architectural history at the University of Virginia. He earned his PhD in history of art from Yale University. His biography of the American painter Grant Wood, A Life, won a national award for arts writing. His forthcoming book, An Historic New England Exhibition, which I'm very pleased to be working with him on, is titled The Importance of Being Furnished. 4 Yankee bachelors at home, and you'll be hearing about that tonight. And with this, I'm going to turn it over to Nikki.
I'm looking forward to hearing about that. Hello, thank you all. Welcome all of you. I'm very excited to give a little overview of what we've been up to at Old North Illuminated. So I want to start out with just kind of a timeline of the highlights of what's been going on at Old North over the last few years. So I think the kind of story of the evolution of our interpretation and identity as both an organization for Old North Illuminated and as a historic site for the church really begins in 2019. Actually, maybe begins in 2012, so I'll start there. In 2012, the organization launched a historic chocolate program that eventually became known as Captain Jackson's Chocolate Shop. I'm sure many of you have been there. Prior to my arrival at Old North, I had been to the chocolate program many times. Delightful experience. I think chocolate is a really easy way to interpret history. We had chocolate in the past, and we still have chocolate today, and people still like it today, so it feels relevant. It's an easy way to start conversations. The demo was very much multi-sensory. You could smell it, you could taste it. It was a really fun program. And in 2019, Steve Ayers, who was my predecessor, and also the vicar of the church for some time, was reading a book by Jared Ross Hardesty, and he came across mentions of Captain Newark Jackson. Jackson had been a congregant at Old North in the colonial era. He was a chocolatier. He was a sea captain. I believe that at that time, the organization had some knowledge that he had also been an enslaver, but did not know the full extent of Jackson's activities. And so through Jared's research, we came to understand that not only was he an enslaver in his business and most likely his household, he was also a human trafficker and in fact had been killed in a mutiny while he was transporting, I believe, 13 enslaved children. And so, of course, it was very upsetting for the organization and really prompted some deep conversations about how we would continue to run the program. It was important to the organization to be very open about the discovery and to use that as a catalyst to change how we would interpret chocolate in the colonial era. So very quickly, Jackson's name came down off of the building. We took it kind of out of the name of the program, but we continued to talk about him, to share what we had learned. And then consultants were brought on to figure out what the next steps were, and then unfortunately, just a few months later, the pandemic hit. At that point, there was an executive transition. Steve retired, and the organization really, in March of 2020, like all of our organizations, just went into survival mode. I joined Old North in June of 2020, and very quickly we reduced to just 3 full-time staff, and we were closed for about 13 months. And so these bigger questions about how we would continue the chocolate program, how that would change our interpretation, really got tabled, and we were fortunate to receive funding from the National Park Foundation to do an organizational strategic plan. And the intent was that this document would not only help us, literally rebuild the organization coming out of the pandemic. I guess I can say that. I mean, I feel like we've come, I don't know. I'm not going to say anything. Rebuild the organization from when we hired people back. We'll do that. And it gave us an opportunity to just ask really fundamental questions like, why do we teach history? Like, what's even the point of all of this? What kind of an organization do we want to be? What do we want people to leave with? Those sorts of things. And fortunately, as a staff and a board, we were able to very quickly align on the idea that we teach history to help us understand the present, but also to shape the future. And I think that was very helpful for them moving us forward into our interpretive plan. We worked with two wonderful consultants to do a site-wide interpretive plan that included not only the chocolate shop, but all of the other narratives that we were telling at the site. If anyone hasn't been to the church, in addition to the church itself, we have an 18th century brick building where the chocolate shop was housed. We have several outdoor spaces as well. And so we wanted to be very careful that we didn't fall into a situation where we're talking about Revere and the lantern signals here, and then we're talking about slavery over here. Maybe or maybe not we'll talk about colonialism there, but these things are very separate and they don't connect. And so in June of 2022, we were able to roll out that new interpretive plan that really gives us, we describe it as a blueprint for how we tell all of these stories. And to kind of wrap up the Jackson story there, because I don't want to leave you all hanging, what we ultimately decided was that talking about things that are very important to talk about, such as, northern urban slavery, what enslavement was like in Boston, how our congregants were connected, that's really challenging to do in a 5-minute chocolate demo. Because we're talking about all of these things that are very challenging and sometimes painful, but the chocolate is delicious. So please try it and buy it as well. So ultimately, what we decided to do was move it into a classroom space. And so while we were closed in that 13 months, we were working very hard to transform it into 2 curricula, one at the 5th grade level and one at the high school level as well. Because these things should be talked about and they should really be considered in depth, and that's much better in a classroom. But, we move forward with a plan that gives us other ways to incorporate these things into the site experience as well. I'm at risk of going over time, so I'm going to move it along now. I was told to put in pictures, so you have some pictures here of what the chocolate program was like, and then what it's like now. And I will just give a quick plug and say that all of our curricula are free and available to teachers across the country. I'm going to skip this. I will just say that as part of the strategic plan, we did outline both a new vision and a new mission for the organization, both of which articulate that question of, well, why do we teach history? Why are we here? Why are we bringing people in? Because I do want to just outline the interpretive plan essential questions, because I think this is interesting to those of you who are all in the history space or adjacent. So for anyone who isn't familiar with the term, the essential questions are really the high-level map of the interpretive plan. And they are meant to be questions that are very open-ended, that prompt deep conversations, that don't necessarily have right or wrong answers, and certainly not easy answers. So the first question is, what does it mean to be an active citizen? And of course, this is very connected to our story of the lantern signals and the events of April 18, 1775. Of course, that is why people come to us. We're always going to tell that story. We're going to use that story to talk about things that are relevant today as well. we talk about how do the perspectives of different individuals or groups change what we think about the American identity. We think that being, rooted in the North End, which is a community that has seen many waves of immigration over the last 300 years, that it's really important to talk about the questions of the American identity and how that changes over time. We also ask the question, what are the enduring implications for societies given that laws, policies, systems, and customs are born from inequitable revolutions? And then lastly, how does art activate social change? So these are the questions that we're trying to answer with all of our on-site experiences, whether that's a self-guided tour, an audio tour, a special program we do, or our curricula and our virtual programming. We're all trying to kind of paddle in this direction at this point. And then lastly, I just wanted to highlight a few things that we are doing. We are very careful not to let our strategic plan grow moldy on the shelf. So some of the things that we've been working on since unveiling the strategic plan, I think the most exciting for us is having a research fellow who is with us full-time for a year. She leaves us in June, so we're starting to come to the end of that year, unfortunately. But we were so lucky to be able to bring in a fellow who I would say really has dual expertise in religion and history and race and gender studies. Could not have wrote the description of a better person than Dr. Crumley. So part of her work has been to produce Illuminating the Unseen, which is a video series. She puts out videos about twice a month, so at a pretty good clip. Because we want her research to be accessible. She's really working to uncover the identities and experiences of Black and Indigenous people who've been connected to the church. But if all we come up with is a list of names, then that's really not useful to people. So I encourage you all to go to our website and check out the videos if you haven't. And then her research is also feeding into a gallery tour, which is a guided experience we offer at the church. An audio guide, which will be a 40-minute deeper dive for our visitors who prefer to learn by listening. It will be available in English and Spanish. It's being included in a new exhibit in the church. We're replacing the panels that are in our pews. And then also, events like a recent director's tour we had to start engaging not only board members, but partners and donors in the work. It's all been very supportive thus far. And then it's part of our PR strategy as well. I will say, I'm just going to give a plug. We work with Teak Media. They are amazing. If any of you are looking for PR, you should call them. They're very good. And I think I'm probably over time, so I'm going to stop there.
Let's see, time. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Welcome. Let's see, so there we go. So I'm going to talk tonight about the Forbes House Museum in Milton. And the building was constructed in 1833 by two sons for their mother. It's a wonderfully generous thing to do. It's also money from the opium trade. I'll speak up loud. So this is, the house tells the story of the China trade, the old China trade, something with which I think most people here are familiar. What gets obscured and elided is that much of that trade, that China trade, was not in porcelain or tea or silk. It was in opium. And this, they made a very brave choice. I would not want to be the person going before the board to say, we want to talk about the family's involvement in opium. But that's what they did. So the first thing you see is this kind of cognitive dissonance. Okay, there's this magnificent building, luxurious, opulent, genteel, polite, civil, but the sign shows the other side of things, the underside of things, okay, where the money came from, where the funding came from. So I became involved in this because I had written a little bit about Robert Bennett Ford and the opium trade. And the wonderful Heidi Vaughn and wonderful Barbara Silberman at the Forbes House Museum asked if I could be back of house, because I'm not very good front of house, but if I could be back of house, and offer some thoughts. And my thoughts were, well, I write about forgotten histories. I write about elided histories. I write about the histories that most people don't want to talk about. And so I can help with that. Are you interested? So I'm going to skip a few things here. I think of this exhibit as part of a long conversation, between, well, first, the primary source objects and documents that you will find at the exhibit. And I do hope you go. It closes March 26th, and it is a magnificent, Ken can attest, it's a magnificent effort. As I said, also a very brave choice. So, excuse me. So you'll see correspondence, you'll see objects, you can look at ship's logs, you can read newspaper accounts. That's the primary source of. Intervening in this conversation, and what I think is responsible for a dominant narrative that whitewashes the story is a historiography produced starting in 1905 and going through Samuel Eliot Morrison's 1921 book, still seen as authoritative, and then Tyler Dennett's 1922 book, Americans in Eastern Asia. There was this outpouring of books on the China trade that presented, I love one of them up there has the subtitle of The History of a Brilliant Era of Achievement. And that was the theme of these books. Okay? There's a third set of writings, okay, done much more recently by people like Marissa Fuentes, Rebecca Solnit, Lisa Lowe, Michelle Rolfe. We can talk about them in the Q&A if you want to, who ask us to look at the archives, not in terms of what they hold, but in terms of the absences and erasures that are there. And so I suggested to the folks at Forbes House Museum, that's what you want to be looking at. And so we will. Okay. And as you can see, this is such a Peabody Museum, wonderful institution, very typical kind of idea here, focusing on tea, and porcelain, and silk, but not the other side of things. Okay. So you enter the museum, okay, and right away you see a content warning. And I'll read it to you here. Bless you. Go back here. Content warning. This exhibit contains images, information, and descriptions of opium and opioids, their uses and their effects. This advisory is offered because many families have experience with the harmful effects of addiction. Please honor any needs you have and feel free to leave or leave in return. So right away, they're bringing in victims. Right away, they're connecting, as you said, Nikki, the past with the present with the future. And right away, they're bringing in victims. And that's forefront. That's right up front. They want to make very clear that these are stories about the past, but also stories about right now and stories about our futures. So I think I turned a page over wrong. It probably doesn't matter. Okay. So you're going to see a lot of these labels, I love the logo, by the way. The logo is wonderful. Logos are powerful, and this one is very powerful. But so is the text, and the text is filled with advisories and caveats about what you're going to see and what you should be very, very wary of. So, because opium was easy to ship and potentially that tempting and inordinately profitable, it fueled a booming trade between America and China in the 1800s. And that's really the crux of things. So you leave the lobby where those labels are, and you come into what they call the billiard room, because it was used as a billiard room at one time. And this is what you're going to see. So let's kind of parse this out a little bit in the time we have. I love this image here because it addresses the question, who? Who exactly was involved in the opium trade? And they note that 11 members of the Forbes family from the early to the late 1800s were very involved in the procurement from Turkey and India, the movement across the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and the smuggling. Because this is a story about not just drugs, but drug smuggling, drug trafficking. And so they identify who's involved. I'm not going to name them. You should go see the exhibit. Okay. And so, here we go. So, and then you'll see the accessories. You'll see images. Some of these are Ken's pictures, which came out really well. The others are mine. And so, I'm sorry. So you'll see some images of opium dens, the end user for the product. You'll see an opium pipe. That doesn't work. Opium paraphernalia. That yellow thing in the center is called an opium pillow. And it's ceramic, not very soft, it's ceramic, but this is where an opium user could keep his or her valuables and rest their head on this. You see some wonderful imagery, and when I say wonderful, I don't mean nice, I mean wonderfully powerful and disturbing. Okay. More caveats. And then I love this because here is another connection that doesn't get made in that first grouping of books I showed you, okay? The luxury, the opulence, the gentility. Okay, this is what the opium paper, oh, it does work, but it doesn't work on the screen, okay. So, go figure. I love this setting. Let's see if I can find the table. Yeah, so you've got these table settings in which you see little placards identifying people who would have been sitting at the table. This makes the opium trade historical, but more than that, it makes it real, because you can see the people who are sitting at that table and dining using these utensils and porcelain and such, and you can just imagine them chatting. I don't think the question of, gee, Bennett, where did the money come from to pay for all of this? But what the little placards do is they invite the visitors to imagine conversations and to actually come up with their own versions of these conversations. A lot of this really involves the visitor in more ways than I can describe this evening, but they really invite the visitor to play a role in the exhibit. It's not a passive experience by any stretch. Okay, I've gone a minute over, for which I must apologize. Please let me turn things over to you. So, I've got to run through a few more. I always over-prepare.
Great. So what I have to say tonight comes from a slightly different perspective. I'm not more as a writer and historian who is very grateful to be able to use the archives and houses of the subjects that I'm dealing with, which was the title, as Ken mentioned earlier, of both the book and the exhibition that will be coming out next spring. So this will be an exhibition at Historic New England, probably starting the beginning of the summer, 24, and the book will be coming out hopefully around the same time. So for Yankee bachelors at home, the book looks at 4 case studies of historic house museums that were either created in their final incarnation or whole cloth by bachelor owners who then turned them into historic house museums. And I say bachelor owners in the way that bachelors would have been understood in the late 19th and early 20th century. These were men whose primary relationships were with other men. But I argue in the book that their real primary relationship was with their houses. They loved these houses and obsessed over these houses, and these houses were their legacies. So the book looks at, some of you all may be familiar with some of these, maybe not all of them. Charles Pendleton House is part of the RISD Museum now in Providence. The Codman Estate in Lincoln, Gibson House right here in Back Bay, and Beauport in Gloucester. These are men who really sort of came of age kind of during the sort of Oscar Wilde, sort of the aftermath of the Oscar Wilde kind of gospel of beauty era, and really believed that their houses themselves were a part of that, kind of gospel. So my job as a writer really has been to sort of tell kind of 4 biographies through interiors and through the houses themselves. And tonight I'm just going to give you a little snippet of an archival kind of intersection that helped me tell a better story of these 2 men. Ogden Codman Jr. And Charles Hammond Gibson Jr. In thinking about these 2 guys, their houses are quite different, and both were sort of patrician Bostonians, but the Codman Estate is really a rural 18th century family seat. 137 Beacon Street is a product of the new land, Back Bay, built by Gibson's grandmother in 1859. So the houses are quite different. The men, in many ways, are quite different. And their archives are very different. So if we start with Gibson's archives, the Gibson archives are housed entirely on the 4th floor of this Back Bay townhouse that are getting kind of heroic attention from Megan Gilardi Holmes, who in her other wearing her other hat is really taking care of these. And I was doing my work actually the summer before Megan arrived. And, things were in cupboards, they were in boxes, there were lots of handwritten manuscripts, like this 1895 etching that you see here on the right. And, I wasn't finding, necessarily what I was hoping to find initially, partly because, I knew that kind of the love of Gibson's life was the so-called Count de Moni, self-styled. He was not a real count, but that is sort of how he went. Maurice de Talbot. All we really had were things like the etching you just saw, these sort of coded sort of poems and bits of prose that are clearly evoking his affair with Maurice de Talbot. And his book, 2 Gentlemen in Touraine. I should have said, Codman was primarily a decorator. Gibson is a writer. In fact, we're sitting right in front of a Codman fireplace here. So this is a bit of Codman here behind me. But Gibson was primarily a writer and tended to write sort of in veiled ways about his life. So 2 Gentlemen in Touraine is really kind of a veiled account of his affair with Maurice de Talleyrand, which took place in the 1890s, primarily in France and in Touraine. So this is sort of his accounting of that. But in looking through the archives, there is almost, excuse me, very little, excuse me, in terms of personal correspondence or anything that really gives you a sense of who these men were or who Gibson was. The only correspondence between them is at the very end of their life, when they're old guys, and the Count is really sort of in his final year. But what happened, which was kind of miraculous, was that when I began working on my Codman chapter, I found Gibson. And that is really only because the Codman family manuscript collection at Historic New England is vast. It is 200, thank you, it is 200 linear feet of manuscripts from the 18th century to the 1960s. I mean, here I had the opposite problem of like, where on earth am I going to start with Codman? How can I possibly penetrate this? What we're looking at is here, this is a 19th century receipt for furniture, an invitation from Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt. On the right, you're seeing part of the clothing collection. I believe this is the underwear shelves. So everything was saved. And what was really kind of wonderful was when I started looking into their correspondence. This is, I'd left Codman writing to his mother, Sarah Bradley Codman, and on the right, him writing to Arthur Little. These are filled with all kinds of information that tell you about Boston in this period. So he asks her, do you want old land or new, when he's looking for a new house for his mother? Do you want Back Bay or Beacon Hill? When he writes to Arthur Little, a fellow architect and designer known as part of the Holy Trinity, along with Herbert Brown, of the Colonial Revival, he's talking about himself. He's talking about his dandified clothes that he's just bought in London, and his mauve shirts and his butterfly ties. And he even sketches for him what his mustache looks like right now, and how he's sort of turning it up. But I also began to see he's writing to these people about Gibson. The families knew one another. He was generationally about a half generation older than Gibson. But here he's writing to his mother, saying, Berkeley Updike came this afternoon. He was full of news about Charlie Gibson and the Demone man. Boston is much excited over this now. Writes to her in 1895, Frank Crownshield and others tell me that the men in Boston think the worst of Charlie Gibson. All of Boston has been talking about them in a horrid way. So in moments like this, you think this is why we have no correspondence at the Gibson House Museum. This was a really painful scandal for the family in Boston. And the correspondence between Codman and Arthur Little reveals even more. There is a kind of ongoing correspondence that tells us, in many ways, a lot about kind of queer Boston in the late 19th and early 20th century, and then more specifically about Gibson himself. So let me give you a couple of examples. So in writing to Arthur Little, they talk about The Slide, which was an infamous gay bar in New York City. It only existed between 1890 and 1892. And they talk endlessly about The Slide and who they met there and what they did there. Codman does not pull punches in these letters. I think partly he thought with as many papers as were going to, posterity, nobody would ever find his letters about The Slide. I did. He is also writing to Arthur Little, who is traveling in Naples and Rome, saying, please bring some pornography home for me from Naples, which he did, and which is at Historic New England. This is a tame example of what Arthur Little was able to bring home for him, or send to him. He said, stick it in a newspaper and send it to me, and make sure you write it to Ogden Codman Jr. Do not send it to Senior. So this is the kind of thing that they're, sending back and forth. But it's in images like this, and it may be hard to see on the right, this gives you a sense of just how ribald, like kind of raw these are. At one point, Arthur Little writes to him and says, you need to redo the Codman family arms, which are family coat of arms are on the left. On the right is a series of phalluses that are all just put together as the new coat of arms for the family, because their letters are filled. They're almost like
that on a t-shirt.
I know. They're almost like middle school boys. They're all talking about their conquests, like who is sleeping with whom, who they're interested in. But there is a long string, as you can imagine, with the handsome young Charlie Gibson that you can see here in the center, of letters back and forth about little Charlie, as they refer to him. And just to give you a sense of their ages, in 1892, which is about when this correspondence starts, it goes from 1892 to 1898, between Little and Codman. Codman is nearly 30. Charlie is barely 18. It starts at about 17. And Arthur Little is 40 at this point. So we're seeing generationally three very different kind of takes on sort of what queer Boston kind of looked like. And Charlie Gibson, even by 18, by their accounts, has already had several long-term relationships in Boston, and they name names, which is why these letters are so striking and so important, because what they say is things like, when we're in Swampscott next summer, we really have to get Charlie Gibson away from, this guy, because we want him for ourselves. It's sort of like, the letters between them, it's sort of like if you remember Dangerous Liaisons, it's sort of like the Marquise de Merteuil and her friend, sort of like, how do we, pry this one away? So they're all talking about little Charlie. And the correspondence goes, as I said, between 1892, 1898. And for Megan, I ended up putting together 24 pages of references between these men. And this is what the Gibson House Archives didn't have when I was looking for it. And it's what's so valuable about the Codman correspondence, because it goes right through the 20s and 30s. They're still calling him Little Charlie when he's middle-aged. But one of the things that really struck me about this too is that Codman goes on to have, actually Codman and Little both marry women in the early 20th century. But Codman continued to have relationships with much younger men who were sort of often seen as his secretaries. This is Ronnie Haddow from the 1920s. But Gibson doesn't. Gibson really sort of seems to have had this kind of one great love affair in the 1890s. And then the house and the history around this love affair begin to kind of gel around the 1890s. And kind of beautiful, 1890s Charlie Gibson becomes enshrined by Charlie Gibson at the house. This is Charlie Gibson's curation of his own mantelpiece above the library, and it is Charlie, Charlie, Charlie. It is 3 Charlie portraits of him as a handsome, desirable young man. And this is the point at which he really wants to freeze himself. It becomes kind of a reverse Dorian Gray. He's always young and desirable in these images, and he becomes this sort of older version of himself. He lives right through into the mid-1950s when the house becomes a house museum. So I told him that this was the one little snippet from the research that I wanted to share tonight about the ways that these historic houses and these historic places begin to tell stories about each other in really surprising ways.
Nice.
So thanks.
Well, thank you all. That was incredible in the short time that we gave you. You packed the information in. I will put a plug in for the Historic New England exhibition coming next year in the spring, so watch for that. Nina and I have worked on topics like this. This is what's taking our field by storm. We've actually written an article, Nina and I, for the Inclusive Historian's Handbook on talking about interpretation, diversity and inclusion equity at historic sites. So that's one of the reasons why we want to bring this panel to you all today. So we've crafted a few questions to start with. Nina and I are going to go back and forth, and then we're going to open this up to you, and if we have any online. So I'm going to start with the first one, and this is to all of you, so anyone who wants to start with this. So why do you think these stories have been excluded from the traditional narrative? You can all answer this. Who wants to start?
Well, I mean, in the case of these men, I mean, obviously I think that a lot of the interpretation of the historic houses since their death has wanted to sort of turn back to the context of the kind of heterosexual families that they came from, rather than on the stories of the men themselves. And to be honest, you know, the men were as active in censoring their own stories as anyone. And so I think it's a kind of a combination of both the subjects and, you know, later curators who felt, well, maybe it's, you know, it's easier to focus on, you know, how tea was served in the house, or, you know, as opposed to like who was sleeping with who in the house. I want to know who was sleeping with who in the house.
And not in the house.
And not in the house.
Well, I think your question gets at a larger question of how do dominant narratives get created? How do they get protected and reinforced? And how do they become situated in our general consciousness? In the case, what I suggested was one way is there's this outpouring of books beginning in 1905 through the 1920s, 1930s, right through the post-World War II period that just keep hammering away at this mythology of a China trade that's not particularly nuanced or subtle, and that strikes, you know, this is like the Alamo at sea. Okay? It's something that is very comfortable to people who are in power, and the other stories are very uncomfortable. Okay?
Well, I agree with both of you. So I guess I would just add, you know, practically speaking, that finding the stories at this point is hard and expensive.
Yeah.
You know, and for a small museum, whether it's a house museum, a historic site, just having the resources, you know, for us having somebody full-time for a year, like, well, you know, our organization is 30 years old and it's the first time that that's happened. And so, you know, whenever I've been doing like press recently, the reporters never write it, but I always say, like, it's expensive. Everything that I outlined that we did, it was not pro bono. It was not, so.
And you're right, in looking at 4 house museums, boy, it is stark when you see the differences between resources that are available, you know, for each.
I think that this is a really interesting time to be either working at a house museum or in the history field. And we all know that while there is an audience that's very receptive to the broader stories and more interesting stories, there's also an audience that may be pushing back. So I'd be interested in to what extent you've had pushback either from the families, the communities, visitors, whatever strikes you as something that we should hear about.
Well, I guess I'll say, you know, for Old North, on the one hand, we're lucky in that we don't have to worry about a family or, you know, somebody who is so close to the work. But on the other hand, because Old North is such a part of our founding mythology that everybody feels like their family, and everyone has an opinion. But I also think just in a day-to-day basis that people have been overwhelmingly supportive. I never read the comments online. I don't think there's a tremendous amount of support there. But in the people who are, you know, paying their $5 ticket and coming in and having a conversation, I think we try to present information in a way that, you know, you read it or you receive it. If you want to talk about it, you can, but you don't have to. And so if somebody comes to Old North and they want to have their blinders on and they just want to hear about the lantern signals, then like that can be their experience, and that's okay. I'm okay with that. But I think our staff have been lucky in that they haven't felt a lot of pushback. And we actually did an audience research study in the second half of 2021 just to kind of assess, like, well, before we put all the money into it, like, do people want this? Like, is this going to positively impact our visitation? And it was positive. It is. So I think people are looking for these stories.
Can I answer your question with two stories? One is I had to talk to Heidi Vaughn, the executive director at Forbes House Museum, to make sure that that what I was going to say was accurate. And she said, so when they proposed this idea to the board, on which sit several members of the Forbes family, they went in feeling rather dicey. The family asked questions, some of them rather pointed questions, but they never received any pushback. They were given full speed ahead. They got no pushback. The second story comes from my own teaching, in which my relatives always ask me if I'm teaching critical race theory, and I always tell them I don't actually know what that is, but I teach a lot of women's history, a lot of African American history, a lot of Afro-Caribbean history, and so on, and gay history, and so on and so on. So when I go into the classroom, this question's in the back of my mind. I'm always thinking I'm going to get a phone call from a parent. And so I go into my classes, and inevitably, the two questions I get from my students are, they're very mad. They're really mad. They're like on fire mad. How come nobody has ever taught me my history before? How come nobody has ever taught me my history before? And the second question is, when are we going to tear down the patriarchy in this course? That's not actually part of my job description, but you go.
I haven't gotten a lot of pushback yet because nobody knows what I'm doing.
There you go. Fly under the radar.
Wait till the spring.
Well, and Tripp, I can say that's not quite true, since we have descendants of the Gibsons in the room.
And I've been speaking about this for years now. This project has been, ongoing for a long time. I should say, I am glad to say that I have gotten nothing but really supportive, kind of help from all of these institutions, including descendants of these men. So it's interesting that the pushback has been less about talking about the men and their relationships and the way in which their identities might have affected the way that they thought about their legacy or thought about their houses, than about things that sometimes surprise me. So I have gotten pushback, for example, from the RISD Museum, who could care less about my sort of talking about Pendleton as someone who may or may not have been gay. But I also talk in the chapter about how they love seeing him as sort of like the pioneer of, colonial collecting. I say, well, was he? Because he seems to have collected a lot of things that you put together and made a story about. So there's been institutional pushback about this is what the story we have been telling about what this house means. And I'm going in and saying, well, there are all kinds of things that we need to revisit about the way that these men sort of operated and put together, their houses. But by and large, I've been really gratified that people are eager to hear these stories, I think.
I want to stick with you, Tripp, and then we're going to open it to the audience. This is a question I'm a little afraid to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. To what extent, when we tell some of these stories, which in fact the individual may have self-centered or didn't want to come out, and they're not public figures, they're just people that happen to own fancy houses, at what point are we invading privacy? And to get to what is an interesting part of the human condition, but where is the line, or is there a line? There may not be.
I think of myself in projects like this and in projects I've done in the past as a biographer. And so I don't feel that line as a biographer. I was saying this one earlier that, my earlier book, A Biography of Grant Wood, I was kind of the first kind of art historian really just sort of publicly out him. And I gave a talk in his hometown, and people were really not happy with me. It was a really hostile crowd. And the first question from the audience was, what we want to know, meaning the town, was why you had to go into his private life. And I just kind of laughed. I said, it's a biography. Like that's what biographers do. So I don't know. Maybe I'm being sort of too simplistic about it. But to me, as a biographer, I want to know everything. And I don't feel like there's a point at which I think, well, my subject doesn't want me to reveal X, Y, or Z. I think it's really important to tell these stories, but I tell them respectfully.
Anyone else comment about that? Okay. Wait a minute, hold on.
They can't hear you on the internet.
Yeah, right, okay. The question is, whose privacy is being protected? These people are long past life. What we are deriving in your research is from written records and experience in how you read these things. And I think the pushback from family is for their own privacy, not the person's.
Interesting, yeah.
And so why do you want to protect the privacy of somebody who's long passed? And why does that concern people currently and in the future?
And there are different cases too as well. If you think about Codman, he was not only recording these letters, but he was saving them. He knew that someone would read them one day, or he would have destroyed them. Gibson may have destroyed his letters, but he would have been thrilled that we were talking, that this was like the final, thing on the screen of him, being a sort of desirable young man. So it's hard to imagine someone's privacy being invaded in a 1905 way versus someone's life being fully explored in an environment when it is far more safe to talk about these things than it was in their own time.
Codman literally saved his dirty underwear to be aired.
Exactly. And his grandfathers. And his great-grandfathers.
Such an interesting moment in exploring these kinds of issues. In today's paper, there was a small item about the National Audubon Society declining to abandon the name of Audubon, although a number of local organizations have, because it's been discovered by looking into the personal life of John James Audubon that he was a slaveholder and a real unpleasant racist, which concerns all of us here, not just academic historians, but particularly what we seem to be focusing on, which is public history. In public history, so much is focused on particular personalities and people. That's the way we engage our publics. And we're discovering both good and evidently there are some aspects of personal lives that are no longer considered as unpleasant as they were in the past. But a lot of our historic figures were real stinkers, and we still have to engage our public with these people who have attained the kind of heroic, mythic stature in our national history. And how do we do that when our perceptions of them are changing and perhaps less flattering than they were in the past?
I'm interested in community of people. So we have men who knew lots of other men and were part of clubs and neighborhoods. letters that you had, copies of letters, you said there were lots of people. Were these all Boston people, part of other Brahmin families, or what did you learn about these, this community people? Because you look at their individual homes, but they all have, networks of people they knew, friends and families.
The names that Codman is raising, it becomes clear that the kind of like the gay dating pool on Beacon Hill was kind of shallow. The same names keep coming up, and they're even like related to each other. Like they're cousins. So it seems to be a kind of a Brahmin circle that overlaps. I mean, that's the whole reason this intersection worked for me, because, of course, because Codman knew Gibson, they sort of knew all these people in common. But
So we've got a question that came in online. Was it difficult to get buy-in from your boards to bring these brave stories to the public? Nikki, was your...
No, I wouldn't say that it was. I think in large part because, our board chair was supportive, and we went through our process knowing that inevitably when you do a strategic plan, it's, possible that someone will leave the board, maybe 2 people will. But in fact, no one did. We didn't really have a lot of pushback. We had a lot of support.
So here in Massachusetts, we've been living through an opioid crisis, and the family felt that it was really important to tell the origin story of the opium crisis and to reveal and uncover attitudes. One of the major questions they ask is, how could people sell opium? Where's their sense of responsibility? Where's their sense of consciousness? And so there were questions that percolated up out of the conversations that reinforce this idea that there's a responsibility to tell this origin story. And one thing I didn't get to show was the last few slides were the 12 or 24 public fora that the family sponsored, that the museum sponsored on the modern opioid crisis in Massachusetts, bringing in victims, bringing in doctors, bringing in, there were school programs even. So there was this real sense that we need to account for this, and maybe we need to be held accountable. I don't want to put words in their mouths, but there was a striking sense of responsibility.
So I'm kind of interested in a group of people that are just beyond the inner circle, so not necessarily the board and the staff, but the people who feel ownership that are a little beyond that. And what I give as an example is in the aftermath of the Harvard study about the connections to slavery, and I work in Beverly, I found the people who were most upset were not the descendants, and I've had some conversations with them, but the members of the community who felt that we were disparaging Israel Thorndike and others who were kind of their people. And I'm wondering if you've also had any of that from people who feel this pride or this connection.
Not at the Forbes house, no.
That's great.
No. If I can just interject quickly, to some extent this is a perennial question. Whose history is it? And this gets back to your work and to your work. Does it belong to a small inner circle? Does it belong to a political party? Does it belong to some civic association? That's the question you folks are wrestling with all the time, is whose history is it? And I think the answer is nobody else's but yours to give. So.
First off, thank you all. This is actually quite enlightening, but also valiant on your part to start to bring these stories forward, and I think that's important. I would be interested in your thoughts of, do we erase things that have happened, or forward and really explain the whole issue and get something out there. So my response to the Audubon Society is, do you erase the name, or do you start to tell the whole story? And I guess I'd be interested in your perspectives on that.
In the case of the Forbes name, they decided that erasure, there had been enough erasure. There had been enough absenting, and look, where did that get us? That it's time to tell the full story.
I would say we had a similar landing, and especially with, Captain Jackson, there was a very pointed conversation of, no, we're still going to talk about it. It tells, a much bigger and more complete narrative of what trade was like in the colonial era, what Boston's role was in human trafficking. And I think, Old North is an interesting case because for us at Old North Illuminated, we're very objective. Our purview is to research and to tell the stories. But I think folks know Old North does still have a congregation as well. And they very much, even though it's not a family connection, I think they would say in some ways it's just as strong. It's, they're spiritual descendants of the congregants who came before them. And I don't know if it's unique to this congregation or if it's, the broader leadership of the Episcopal Church, but the congregation, I think, has been just as open. And I think they, wrestle with it from their perspective as well.
And I think telling these stories doesn't eclipse other stories. It illuminates an entire story. So, is my Codman chapter entirely about who he was hooking up with? No, I mean that's I think an important part of the story. But he's also a brilliant designer, and had all of these other sort of dimensions to his life. And this was one part of that life. So, my object is not to uncover the story that hasn't been told and then let that story sort of fill the room. It's to sort of invite that story into the conversation so that it can be, so that you can see kind of the full person and get a better sense of, who we're talking about. Not to the exclusion of, talking about them in other ways.
I just want to jump in and say, in terms of teaching and all, it behooves us to tell a more complete story. Thank you for answering that question.
Yeah.
Because that's our job as the story. And I'm trying to be much better at listening rather than thinking about my questions, so I'm going to have to try to get my thoughts together a little bit. When you're talking about the full story, I see there is pushback to lots of organizations when they go that route. But it's strange to me because I have amassed a fairly large following telling the full story. That's exactly what I do. But I don't have to answer to anybody to do it. And so what is the solution, or how can organizations embrace that, and how can, does it matter that people fall off? Are you gaining new people because you're actually doing that? What's the, how can we be better communicators of that whole story?
I think I would say, in my opinion, it doesn't matter if people fall off. I mean, we've had that discussion, with our board and with our staff, and we're okay with that. I think we believe that we know best how to tell our place's story. We are very intentional to put information out there in a way that, isn't intentionally confrontational. I think we do have that obligation as museums or historic sites or whatnot to figure out, well, how do you make a challenging topic engaging? How do you make it palatable? That was a big part of the consulting we got through our interpretive plan. And we're very thankful for that. I think maybe that helps us not get that kind of pushback in person. But, from the beginning of the journey, I think we've been very upfront internally that, if a donor doesn't want to give us their $100 a year anymore, that's fine. We're fine. We'll probably find another one. It's okay. It's fine.
It's a little like the discourse that you hear. Well, there's always been slavery. Women have always had fewer rights than men. It's always been that way. It's a discourse that's used to reinforce the power that some people have in our society. I guess my answer is it's always been a struggle. People have always pushed against slavery. They've always pushed for women's rights, and so on and so on and so on. Your job is not going to end. It will always be a struggle because there will always be people in society who want to push back at the narratives you are opening and introducing people to. I think what you need to remember is, as in the case of your work and your work, there are visitors who are going to feel validated.
Right.
You're going to do the deity's work. I'm trying to. You're doing somebody's work. You're doing really important work. When a kid walks out of your museum, your historic site, and they feel validated, knowing that this person was gay or their ancestors were enslaved, that's the best thing that could happen. He says as an academic historian, that doesn't have to deal with this stuff.
So with that, I want to thank Bob and Ann from the Colonial Society for helping us tonight. One more. Okay, last final question. Okay, and you can.
Okay. Well, it's a two-part. They asked, Nikki, could you please tell us about the shareholders in your interpretive planning process were, who they were? What was the organization's relationship with these individuals before they assisted with the plan? And what is their relationship to the organization now?
Yes, so our interpretive plan began with a series of interviews and kind of focus groups. I'm trying to remember now, I think we connected with about 35 or 40 people, either individually or in those groups. And it really was a mix of people who either had worked at the organization or were on the board, partner sites, a few donors as well. And they've been, pretty updated and engaged along the way.
Thank you. And then they also asked, for the panel regarding marketing, has the marketing for these sites come to promote more things simultaneously? The ones visitors traditionally associate with the properties, plus the new topics. Have the new topics replaced the old, or is the marketing segmented?
I know at least I can say at least 2 of the 4 sites, there have been pride tours that have been introduced at the Gibson House and at Beauport. And I think, I don't know, I feel like, and it's not just my work, it's the work of, curators who are working at these sites and the site managers who are really beginning to tell these stories. I would say they, across the board, they are additional stories. They are not replacing stories that have been told. And it's really exciting to see, as you say, sort of new constituencies who come to these houses and think, I thought this house had nothing to say to me, and maybe it does. And I think that's kudos to curators like Megan and others who are really sort of finding ways to, reintroduce a house that everyone thinks they know, and they don't.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Nina, for helping to put this together. Nikki, Dane, and Tripp. Wonderful conversation. Lots to think about. So thank you all.
Thank you.